Ma'am, please stand up and come with me. The air marshal's voice was sharp, final. Passengers stared as 17-year-old Nia clutched her tablet, her heart pounding. A white woman's trembling voice cut through the silence. I don't feel safe sitting next to her kind. The accusation spread like wildfire, twisting glances into judgment. The officer's hand rested on his gun. The captain avoided her eyes. And in that instant, the young prodigy who'd earned her place in first class became a suspect in her own success. What none of them knew was that her father, one phone call away, owned the power to ground not just the plane, but their entire illusion of control. Have you ever been judged solely by your appearance? Ever walked into a room and felt the weight of assumptions pressing down on you before you even spoke? If you've experienced the sting of prejudice or witnessed the quiet violence of discrimination, drop your experiences in the comments below. And if you believe justice should be blind, but isn't always, hit that subscribe button and share this video. In exactly 47 minutes, not just a seat, but an entire 300-passenger aircraft will be grounded. 3 careers will end, and 1 corporation will face a billion-dollar reckoning. 10:17 a.m. First class cabin, Denver International Airport. The scent of premium leather and subtle air freshener was the first thing Nia Roberts noticed. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of Denver International's Terminal B, a human river of frantic energy she had just navigated. Here in Seat 2A of Transcontinental Airlines Flight 457, a non-stop to San Francisco, the world was serene. The seat was less a seat and more a personal pod, a cocoon of beige upholstery and polished chrome that whispered of exclusivity. At 17, Nia was no stranger to air travel, but this was different. This was her first time flying solo in first class. It was a graduation gift from her father Marcus, but it was also a practical necessity. Tucked into the oversized carry-on at her feet was a prototype for a neural interface. She had designed this delicate piece of equipment worth more than the car she'd be learning to drive next year. The flight wasn't just a journey. It was the first leg of her future. In San Francisco, she was set to begin a 3-month fellowship at the prestigious Horizon Applied Sciences Incubator, a place where teenage prodigies were given millions in funding to turn their wildest ideas into reality. Nia's neural interface promised to revolutionize how people with severe disabilities could communicate, potentially giving voice to those who had been silenced by their conditions. Nia was a creator, a builder. Her world was one of code circuits and the elegant logic of machine learning. She saw the world in systems and patterns, and the pattern she was currently observing was one of quiet efficiency. A flight attendant with a warm smile and a name tag that read, Sophia had already offered her a pre-departure drink. She'd chosen sparkling water with lime, and the low hum of the Boeing 787's auxiliary power was a soothing mantra. She pulled out her tablet, not to watch a movie, but to review the final lines of her presentation code. Her fingers danced across the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was in her element, a focused island of intellectual rigor in a sea of opulent calm. Marcus Roberts's words echoed in her mind from their conversation the previous evening. You've earned your place at every table you sit at, Nia. Never let anyone make you feel you have to apologize for being there. Her father had built his digital security empire, Nexus Digital Security, from nothing, facing doubters and barriers at every turn. He taught her that dignity wasn't requested, it was claimed. The memory of their dinner last night remained sharp in her mind. Marcus had taken her to their favorite restaurant, a small Ethiopian place they'd been going to since she was little. Between bites of injera and dorowat, he'd leaned forward and said, Tomorrow, you fly first class. Not because I can afford it, but because you deserve it. Remember when I took that first business trip to Japan? Nia nodded. She'd been 10, and it was the first time he'd been gone for more than a day. I sat in economy, squeezed between 2 executives who never once looked me in the eye. They assumed I'd gotten on the wrong plane. The flight attendant checked my ticket 3 times. He smiled, the kind of smile that masked an old wound, but I didn't say a word. I just sat there, did my work, and proved them wrong by existing. That's the last time I let anyone decide where I belong. Nia adjusted her simple black hoodie, running her fingers along the edge of her tablet. Her braided hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her only accessories a pair of small diamond studs, a gift from her father when she won her first coding competition at 13. She dressed for comfort for herself, not to meet the expectations of others. But she knew even at 17 that her presence in certain spaces was seen as an intrusion by some. Her father had prepared her for this reality without letting it define her. The delicate equilibrium was disturbed by a sharp, perfumed sigh. Nia looked up from her tablet to see a woman in her mid-50s maneuvering a rigid, oversized designer handbag into the overhead bin above seat 2B, directly across the aisle. The woman was impeccably dressed in a tailored cream-colored pantsuit. Her blonde hair was coiffed into a helmet of immovable perfection. A Rolex gleamed on her wrist, and a string of pearls adorned her neck. Her face, however, was soured into a mask of faint disapproval as her eyes swept over Nia. It was a look Nia had seen before, a look that assessed her dark skin, her neatly braided hair, her simple but stylish hoodie and jeans, and concluded that they did not belong in this environment. The woman's gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a silent audit that found Nia wanting. Elizabeth Harrington was not having a good day. As Senior Vice President of Sales at Westbrook Pharmaceuticals, she was accustomed to controlling her environment. Her morning had begun with an email from the board questioning her division's numbers, followed by a spilled coffee on her original blouse, forcing her to change into her backup outfit kept at the office for emergencies. Now she was running late for an important meeting in San Francisco, and the airline had the audacity to seat her across from this a teenager in a hoodie. In first class, her first class. "Excuse me?" Elizabeth said, her voice crisp and carrying an unearned authority. She wasn't speaking to Nia, but to the air around her, as if summoning a subordinate. Miguel Sanchez, a younger flight attendant with an anxious-to-please demeanor, hurried over. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes darted nervously around the cabin. At 26, he was still relatively new to the job, having joined Transcontinental just 6 months ago. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with that?" he offered, gesturing to the still open bin. "I can handle my own bag, thank you," she snapped, before lowering her voice to a conspiratorial yet clearly audible whisper. "I just want to be sure everything is in order in this cabin. There seems to be some confusion about the seating." She flicked her eyes pointedly toward Nia. Miguel glanced between them, unsure how to respond. "Is there a problem with my seating assignment?" he asked, trying to sound professional. "Well," Elizabeth replied, adjusting her pearls, "I just find it unusual to see certain types of passengers in first class. Perhaps you could verify her ticket." Miguel swallowed hard, his discomfort visible. "All passengers are seated according to their purchased tickets, ma'am." Elizabeth, taking his uncertainty as agreement, continued in that same stage whisper. "I mean, standards must be maintained, don't you think?" As she settled into her seat, Elizabeth pulled out her phone and began thumbing through emails. 3 years ago, she had interviewed for a director position at Nexus Digital Security. The interview had gone poorly. The position required technical knowledge she didn't possess, and the salary was less than she was making at Westbrook. She'd been insulted when they'd sent a polite rejection letter. She hadn't recognized the Roberts name, but something about the girl's confident posture reminded her of that humiliation. Elizabeth didn't consider herself prejudiced. She would never use that word. She considered herself a realist, someone who understood the natural order of things, and in that natural order, girls like the one across the aisle didn't sit in first class, unless they were celebrities or athletes, neither of which this one appeared to be. It was in Elizabeth's mind simply a matter of patterns and probabilities, and probably a mistake that would soon be corrected. Chapter 24 a.m. Boarding nearly complete. Nia felt a familiar hot knot tighten in her stomach. She refused to look over. She kept her eyes fixed on her tablet, the lines of Python code suddenly seeming like a foreign language. She could feel Elizabeth's stare as a physical weight on her shoulder. She told herself to ignore it. This woman was just a random data point of unpleasantness in a world full of it and an anomaly in the system. Miguel, the flight attendant, glanced from Elizabeth to Nia, his inexperience showing. He was a deer in the headlights caught between a demanding passenger and a potential conflict he clearly didn't know how to handle. "All passengers have been boarded according to their tickets, ma'am," he stammered. Behind his professional smile, Miguel's thoughts raced. 6 months on the job, and I'm already facing this. My sister's tuition payment is due next week. Mum's medication costs doubled last month. I can't afford a complaint on my record. The pressure crushed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. "Really?" Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with skepticism. She finally settled into her seat, pulling her seatbelt tight with a series of sharp, angry tugs. "Because it's my understanding that first class is for paying customers, not guests or people who've wandered into the wrong section." The insinuation was as thick and suffocating as the cabin air before the filtration system fully kicked in. Nia's fingers tightened on her tablet. She knew she had two options. She could shrink, make herself small and invisible, and pray the woman would lose interest, or she could hold her ground. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from a conversation they'd had just last week. "You've earned your place at every table you sit at, Nia. Never let anyone make you feel you have to apologize for being there." For a fleeting moment, she considered giving in, taking the path of least resistance, moving to another seat if available, or even requesting a downgrade to economy. The thought of spending 6 hours next to this woman's quiet hostility was exhausting. The burn of injustice flared hot in her chest, quickly replaced by a cooler, more determined resolve. No, this was exactly what people like Elizabeth Harrington counted on, that their targets would choose invisibility over confrontation. She took a slow, deliberate breath, closed her tablet, and placed it in the seatback pocket. Then she turned her head and met Elizabeth Harrington's icy gaze with a calm, steady one of her own. "Is there a problem?" Nia asked, her voice even and clear, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The directness of the question seemed to momentarily startle Elizabeth. She blinked, her pursed lips tightening further. "I was just expressing a concern about airline security and seating integrity." She deflected, wrapping her prejudice in the sterile language of corporate policy. One can't be too careful these days. Before Nia could respond, Sophia Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, arrived. Her presence was a bomb of professionalism. She had overheard the exchange from the galley and recognized the situation immediately. At 38, with 15 years of experience, she had seen this scenario play out many times before. "Ms. Harrington, is everything all right with your seat?" Sophia asked, her tone polite but firm, subtly reclaiming control of the situation from Miguel. "My seat is fine," Elizabeth replied, gesturing with a flick of her wrist towards Nia. "I'm just not convinced hers is." Sophia turned to Nia, a hint of apology in her eyes. "Miss May, I see your boarding pass for a moment just to clear this up for the other passenger." The knot in Nia's stomach tightened into a painful fist. It was humiliating. She was being audited publicly because this woman had decided she didn't look the part, but she also understood Sophia was trying to de-escalate. Arguing would only make it worse. With methodical precision, she reached into her bag, pulled out the crisp paper of her boarding pass, and handed it to Sophia. Sophia glanced at it, her expression unchanging. "Thank you, Miss Roberts," she said pointedly, using Nia's name as she handed it back. She then turned to Elizabeth. "As you can see, the passenger in 2A is ticketed for this seat. Everything is in order. We will be closing the cabin door for departure in just a few moments." Sophia's words were final. She gave Elizabeth a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and retreated towards the front of the cabin. For a moment, there was silence. Nia felt a small wave of relief. It was over. She was wrong. In the third row just behind them, Dr. Amir Patel adjusted his glasses and silently observed the interaction. A professor of civil rights law and author of several books on transportation discrimination, he recognized what was happening immediately. Without drawing attention to himself, he carefully positioned his phone to record the scene. In his experience, documentation was often the only defense against prejudice. "This feels familiar," he whispered to himself. I've documented 47 similar incidents on commercial flights in the past year alone. This data will be invaluable for my research. The air in the cabin grew thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on Naya's arms stand on end. The ventilation system hummed softly, pushing recycled air through the confined space. Outside, the Windows ground crews moved in choreographed efficiency, preparing the aircraft for departure. Inside, a different kind of performance was unfolding. For people like Elizabeth Harrington, it was never over. She had been publicly contradicted, and her sense of superiority was wounded. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, her thumbs tapping furiously across the screen. Nia tried once more to retreat into her own world, pulling out noise-cancelling headphones. But as she did, she heard Elizabeth's voice, now low and venomous, speaking into her phone. "Yes, I'm on the flight. No, it's a mess. There's a person up here who is being very aggressive and confrontational. The flight attendants aren't doing anything. Frankly, I don't feel safe." Nia's blood ran cold. The script had been flipped. The accusation had escalated from "you don't belong here" to "you are a threat." Elizabeth Harrington wasn't just prejudiced. She was weaponizing it, turning a quiet teenager into an aggressive threat in the post-911 lexicon of air travel. The system wasn't just experiencing an anomaly, it was being deliberately corrupted, and Nia was the target. The lie hung in the air of poisonous vapor. Nia could feel the atmosphere in the cabin shift. A few nearby passengers who had overheard Elizabeth's phone call now cast nervous, furtive glances in her direction. She was no longer just a young woman in first class. She was now the subject of a security concern, a potential problem. The presumption of her innocence had been stolen in a single malicious sentence. Across the aisle in seat 1C, an elderly white gentleman in an expensive suit frowned, shaking his head slightly. He'd been watching the entire interaction. Now he leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Disgraceful behavior. That poor girl hasn't done a thing." Behind Nia in row 3, a middle-aged Latina woman caught her eye in the reflection of the window and gave her a small, encouraging nod, a silent gesture of solidarity. However, 2 businessmen in row 4 were now watching Nia wearily, one whispering to the other, "Maybe we should say something to the crew." The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and they were beginning to take root in some minds. An older woman with a Republican Party pin on her lapel nodded in agreement with Elizabeth, muttering, "Standards used to mean something in this country." A man in his 60s wearing a clerical collar leaned forward from his seat and spoke softly to his seatmate judge, "Not lest you be judged. This isn't what our faith teaches us." His companion, an elderly woman with a cross necklace, nodded in agreement, her eyes troubled as she watched the scene unfold. Dr. Patel continued his discreet recording, making sure to capture Elizabeth's false claims and the divided reactions of the other passengers. Nia removed her headphones, the silence of the cabin now more deafening than any music. She looked to Sophia, who was busy with pre-flight checks near the cockpit door, seemingly unaware of this new escalation. Miguel, however, had heard it. He stood frozen near the galley, his eyes wide, looking at Nia as if seeing her for the first time through Elizabeth Harrington's distorted lens. 10:31 a.m., 15 minutes since boarding began. Elizabeth ended her call with a dramatic snap of her clutch burst. She flagged down Miguel as he passed. "Young man," she said, her voice now filled with a manufactured tremor of fear. "That girl," she jutted her chin towards Nia, "was incredibly hostile when I questioned her seating, and the other attendant just brushed me off. Given the circumstances, I must insist you get a security officer. I want her credentials properly verified. I will not be trapped in a metal tube for 6 hours with someone who becomes aggressive at the slightest provocation." This was the twist of the knife. She was framing her own prejudice as a legitimate safety concern, a tactic that was as cowardly as it was effective. She was using the very systems designed to protect passengers as a tool of harassment. Miguel, utterly out of his depth, swallowed hard. "Ma'am," the other flight attendant confirmed her ticket. Confirmed a piece of paper. Elizabeth scoffed. "In this day and age, that's not enough. I want a federal officer to check her ID against the manifest. It's standard procedure when a passenger is causing a disturbance." "But she hasn't caused a disturbance," Miguel whispered, casting a desperate look at Nia. Her hostile reaction was the disturbance. Elizabeth insisted, her voice rising. "Are you refusing to act on a passenger security concern? I will be taking your name and employee number." The threat worked perfectly. Miguel's face palled. The fear of a formal complaint of a black mark on his record outweighed his fledgling sense of duty. Without another word, he turned and skewed towards the cockpit. As Miguel retreated, he passed Sophia in the galley, his face a mask of conflict. "I can't lose this job, Sophia," he whispered urgently. "My mom's medication, my sister's tuition. They all depend on me, but what she's doing to that girl." He shook his head. "It's wrong." Sophia squeezed his shoulder. "I know, Miguel. I've been there." Her voice softened. "Remember when I told you about that Asian family last year? I stood up for them and almost lost my promotion, but I couldn't sleep for weeks knowing I'd stayed silent before." Miguel nodded, grateful for her understanding. "What do we do now?" "Go get the captain." Sophia sighed. "I'll handle this, and Miguel. After this is over, we're going to talk about creating a support system for crew members to protect each other when these situations happen." Meanwhile, a young woman across the aisle, a college student around 19, was surreptitiously recording the scene on her phone. Her expression a mixture of disgust and fascination. Another passenger, a businessman in his 40s, was studiously avoiding looking in Nia's direction, the uncomfortable silence of the privileged bystander. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was spiraling. She was a character in a play she didn't write, and the script was getting darker by the second. A flash of anger surged through her, white hot and electric. She wanted to stand up, to shout, to call this woman exactly what she was, a bigot, using her privilege as a weapon. Her hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. The injustice of it burned like acid in her throat. Then, just as quickly, she regained control. Getting angry would only validate Elizabeth's lies. She uncurled her fingers, took a deep breath, and centered herself. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of proving her false narrative correct. The cockpit door opened, and the first officer leaned out. He exchanged a few hushed words with Miguel, his eyes scanning the first-class cabin. His gaze rested on Nia for a moment, unreadable, before he nodded and retreated back inside. Miguel returned to his position, avoiding Nia's eyes. He whispered to Sophia, who glanced at Nia with a mixture of pity and resignation. The whispers spread like a virus through the cabin crew. A moment later, the gentle cabin chimes were replaced by a firm announcement from the flight deck. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson. We apologize for the slight delay. We are dealing with a minor cabin issue and have asked for ground personnel to assist. We appreciate your patience and expect to be on our way shortly." A minor cabin issue. That's what she was. A problem to be solved, a thing. The humiliation was a physical sensation, now a hot flush that spread from her chest to her cheeks. She wanted to be invisible, to shrink into the luxurious upholstery of seat 2A until she disappeared completely. But then she thought of her father, of the prototype in her bag, of the fellowship waiting for her. She had done nothing wrong. She would not be erased. She squared her shoulders and met the curious and suspicious stares of the other passengers with a calm she didn't feel. The jet bridge, which had just begun to pull away, groaned as it redocked with the aircraft. The cabin door hissed open. A gate agent and a uniformed officer stepped inside, but it wasn't an airport police officer. Nia recognized the insignia and the severe, no-nonsense demeanor immediately. This was a federal air marshal. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a military-style haircut and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His name tag read R. Collins. He bypassed the flight attendants completely and walked directly to Elizabeth Harrington's seat, his presence sucking the remaining oxygen out of the cabin. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Collins. I'm told you have a security concern." He said, his voice a low, growly rumble that commanded attention. Elizabeth launched into her performance, pointing a trembling finger at Nia. "Yes, officer." This person became extremely agitated and aggressive when I simply asked about the seating arrangements. Her ticket seems questionable, and her whole demeanor is threatening. The flight staff refused to take it seriously. I'm afraid for my safety and the safety of this flight. Officer Collins didn't even glance at Sophia, who was standing beside him, her mouth open in disbelief. He didn't ask for her side of the story or consult the captain. He turned his full, intimidating attention on the 17-year-old girl in seat 2A. His eyes were cold flat and utterly devoid of curiosity. They were the eyes of a man who had already made up his mind. He saw not a teenage girl, a student, a gifted inventor. He saw the aggressive and threatening subject of a complaint. He saw a problem to be removed. "Miss," he began, his voice leaving no room for argument, "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." The officer's words hung in the sterile, recycled air of the cabin. "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the unassailable weight of federal authority. For a moment, Naya couldn't breathe. The entire world had shrunk to the space between her and Officer Collins. The faces of the other passengers blurred into a gallery of muted curiosity and discomfort. All the systems she believed in, logic, reason, fairness, were failing spectacularly. A lie had been told, and the man with the gun and the badge had accepted it as gospel. "Officer, on what grounds?" Naya asked. Her voice was steady, a small miracle she would later marvel at. The programmer in her brain was screaming for data, for a logical premise to this absurd conclusion. Collins's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being questioned, especially not by a teenager. "On the grounds that you are causing a disturbance and failing to comply with crew instructions," he stated, clipping his words. "I have not caused a disturbance," Naya countered, her voice rising slightly, "and I have complied with every instruction. Your colleague," she gestured towards Sophia, "verified my boarding pass. This woman," she nodded towards Elizabeth, "is lying." Sophia Reynolds stepped forward, her face a mask of professional courage. "Officer Collins, I am the lead flight attendant for this cabin. I can confirm that Miss Roberts has been polite and cooperative. Her ticket is valid. The other passenger, Ms. Harrington, initiated this confrontation. There is no security threat here." Collins gave Sophia a look of withering dismissal. "Your job is to serve drinks, not to make security assessments. Stand back." The insult was sharp and public, designed to neuter Sophia's authority and put her back in her place. Sophia flinched as if struck, her face turning a shade of angry red, but she held her ground, remaining near Nia's seat. Collins focused back on Nia. "I'm not going to ask you again. Get your things. Let's go." He took a step closer, his physical presence an act of intimidation. Nia felt a primal surge of fear, but it was quickly overtaken by a cold, sharp anger. This was wrong. This was a perversion of everything she'd been taught about justice. If she walked off this plane, she would be validating Elizabeth's lie. She would be accepting the role of the aggressor they had written for her. "No," she said. The word was quiet but firm. A small stone dropped into a silent pool. "I am a ticketed passenger in my assigned seat. I have done nothing wrong. I am not leaving." A collective gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Dr. Patel, in seat 3C, adjusted the angle of his phone slightly. He was capturing at all the officer's aggressive posture, the flight attendant's plea, the teenager's quiet defiance. Officer Collins's face darkened. The veneer of professional detachment cracked, revealing the raw prejudice beneath. He saw a black teenager defying a white officer, and it was a scenario his worldview could not tolerate. "You are now interfering with the duties of a federal air marshal." He growled, his hand moving almost unconsciously to rest on the butt of his holstered firearm. "That is a federal offense. I can and will have you arrested and removed from this aircraft in handcuffs. Is that what you want?" The sight of his hand on the weapon sent a cold rush of adrenaline through Nia's body. Her mouth went dry, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The leather seat beneath her suddenly felt like ice. There was a roaring in her ears, like standing too close to a waterfall. This man, this armed federal agent, was threatening her over a seat she had paid for all because another passenger couldn't accept her presence. The threat of handcuffs of an arrest record was terrifying. It could derail everything, the fellowship, her future, her life. The fear was a cold hand squeezing her heart. She could feel tears welling up hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. Crying would be seen as hysteria, as guilt. "You can't arrest me for sitting in a seat I paid for," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "I have rights. Your rights end when you become a threat to my flight." Collins retorted, his voice booming through the cabin. "And right now, you are the threat." "You're not afraid of me," Nia said, suddenly finding her voice again stronger now. "You're afraid of what I represent, a world where your privilege isn't the only currency that matters." She straightened her back, looking directly into his eyes. "I won't be intimidated out of spaces I've earned the right to occupy. Your badge doesn't give you the right to enforce prejudice." A hushed silence fell over the cabin at her words. Even Collins seemed momentarily stunned by her eloquence and defiance. "My existence is not a threat," Nia continued, her voice clear and steady. "But your bias is—" "Keep talking," Collins growled. "And you're just digging yourself deeper." "No," Nia replied, unblinking. "I'm standing my ground. There's a difference." Elizabeth Harrington watched from her seat, a sickeningly self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. This was exactly what she had wanted. The validation of her prejudice, the exercise of her privilege, the public humiliation of the girl who didn't belong. She had successfully manipulated the system, bending its power to serve her own petty bigotry. 10:38 a.m., point of no return. The pilot, Captain Thomas Wilson, emerged from the cockpit, his face grim. He was a man in his late 50s with a calm, authoritative air, but the situation in his first-class cabin was now spiraling beyond the scope of a simple passenger dispute. "Officer, what's the issue here?" Wilson asked, his voice a low baritone that cut through the tension. "The issue," Captain Collins said, not bothering to turn around fully, "is that this passenger is being disruptive and refusing to deplane. She needs to be removed before we can take off." Captain Wilson looked at Nia, then at Sophia, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, a silent signal that Collins's account was false. The captain was now in an impossible position. The flight was already delayed. He had a federal officer on his aircraft declaring a passenger a threat, but his most experienced flight attendant was telling him a different story. The ultimate authority on the plane was his, but to overrule a federal air marshal was a career-risking move. He looked at Nia, his expression one of weary pragmatism. "Miss," he said, his tone softer than Collins's, but no less final. "We have to get this flight in the air. We can sort this out on the ground. For the good of everyone on board, I am asking you to cooperate with the officer." It was a betrayal from the last person she thought would fold. The captain wasn't siding with the lie, but he was choosing the path of least resistance. He was choosing to sacrifice her dignity for the sake of an on-time departure. The knot of fear and anger in Nia's chest coalesced into a single point of clarity. They had taken away her voice. They had ignored her proof. They had rejected the testimony of the crew. They had left her with nothing. Almost nothing. "Okay," she said, her voice suddenly calm. The sudden acquiescence surprised Collins and the captain. "I will cooperate, but the law says I am entitled to one phone call. I'd like to make it now before I go anywhere." Collins scoffed. "You're not under arrest yet. You don't get a phone call. It's not a legal right. It's an airline policy for disputed passengers being removed from a flight." Sophia interjected quickly, seeing a lifeline and grabbing it. Transcontinental Policy 4.7 clearly states she's allowed a brief call to arrange for her needs on the ground. It was a slight fabrication, a bending of a vague rule, but it was delivered with such authority that Collins hesitated. Captain Wilson, eager to end the standoff, seized the opportunity. "Let her make the call, officer. 5 minutes, then we can resolve this." Collins grunted his assent, crossing his arms and tapping his foot impatiently. He believed he had won. He saw this as the final futile gesture of a troublemaker before her inevitable removal. Dr. Patel watched the scene unfold with growing concern. This was a textbook case of profiling exactly the kind of incident he had documented dozens of times in his research. This is precisely the type of escalation I described in Chapter 4 of my book, he whispered to himself, making a mental note. The performance of authority as a substitute for actual justice. The fact that it was happening to a minor made it even more troubling. He continued recording, making sure to capture the faces of all involved. The passengers in economy class were growing restless. The delay was now approaching 20 minutes, and rumours were beginning to circulate about some kind of security issue in first class. A few craned their necks, trying to see what was happening, but the privacy divider between cabins blocked their view. Elizabeth Harrington sat back, a look of triumph on her face. She had done it. She had reclaimed her space, asserted her dominance over this interloper. The fact that it had escalated to a federal officer removing the girl was unfortunate but necessary. After all, rules existed for a reason, and people needed to learn their place. Nia pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking, but her fingers were steady as she navigated to her contacts. She ignored the texts from her friends, asking if she'd boarded yet. She went straight to the top of her favorites list, the one marked with a star. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then a calm, familiar voice answered. "Nah, bae, everything okay? You should be taking off." "Hi, Dad." Nia said, her voice breaking just a little. "Not exactly. I have a problem." And as Officer Collins and Captain Wilson stood by impatiently, and Elizabeth Harrington watched with glee, Nia Roberts began to explain the situation to her father. Marcus Roberts was in his office on the 58th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, a room with panoramic views that usually calmed him. He had been reviewing quarterly threat assessment reports, a litany of digital phantoms, and corporate espionage attempts. When his phone rang with Nia's picture on the screen, he had smiled, expecting a quick call before she powered down for her flight. The smile vanished as he listened. His daughter's voice, usually so full of confidence and spark, was strained, trembling on the edge of tears, but held in check by sheer force of will. He listened without interrupting as she laid out the facts with the clinical precision he had taught her. The woman in 2B, the false accusations, the flight attendant who tried to help the arrival of an air marshal named Collins, the pilot's request for her to leave, and the ultimatum. With every word, a cold, tectonic fury built deep within him. Marcus Roberts was a man who had built a global digital security empire from nothing. He had faced down hostile boardrooms, outmaneuvered corporate raiders, and negotiated with governments. He understood power not just in the form of money, but in the form of information and leverage. The one thing in the world he was truly vulnerable to was the well-being of his child. And these people, these strangers on an airplane, were hurting his child. His first instinct was primal. He wanted to roar, to threaten to unleash the full force of his considerable resources on this Officer Collins, but he smothered it instantly. Rage was a blunt instrument. This situation required a scalpel. 25 years earlier, Marcus had been detained by a mall security guard who had accused him of shoplifting. He'd been 19, a brilliant computer science student at MIT wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. The guard had never checked the receipt in his bag. He'd been paraded through the mall in handcuffs, only to be released 2 hours later when the store manager confirmed he'd paid for the programming book. No one had apologized. No one had been punished. Marcus had been expected to simply accept the humiliation as a cost of existence. That night, he'd made a promise to himself. If he ever had the power to change that equation, to make the cost of humiliation fall on the perpetrators rather than the victims, he would use it without hesitation or mercy. That moment had arrived. "Nia," he said, his voice a paradigm of calm. "Listen to me very carefully. Are you on speaker?" "No, Dad. Put me on speaker. Hold the phone up so the officer and the captain can hear me clearly." Nia did as she was told. "You're on speaker, Dad." "Good." Marcus's voice, rich and resonant, filled the silent cabin. "My name is Marcus Roberts. I am Naya's father. To whom am I speaking? Officer Collins, annoyed by the delay, stepped forward. This is Federal Air Marshal Richard Collins. Sir, your daughter needs to deplane immediately. This call is over. No, Officer Collins. This call is just beginning. Marcus replied, his tone hardening. You are currently illegally detaining my minor daughter based on the unsubstantiated and frankly slanderous claims of another passenger. You have ignored the testimony of the airline's own lead flight attendant, and you are attempting to remove my daughter from a service she has paid for. Sir, your daughter is a security risk. My daughter Marcus cut him off his voice like cracking ice as a 17-year-old girl on her way to a science fellowship. The only security risk in that cabin right now. Officer Collins is you, a federal agent who is so blinded by his own biases that he cannot distinguish between a passenger and a threat. You are a liability. A nervous murmur went through the cabin. The passengers were no longer just watching a dispute. They were listening to a takedown. Captain Wilson stepped in, trying to reclaim his aircraft. Mr. Roberts, this is Captain Thomas Wilson. I understand you're upset, but we need to handle this on the ground. Captain Wilson, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. I hold you responsible. You are the commander of this vessel, yet you are allowing a member of your crew and a passenger to be harassed by an overzealous officer. You've chosen expediency over your duty of care. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he delivered the first incision of the scalpel. I'm sure you're both busy men, so let me get to the point. Nia, what's the name of the airline you're flying transcontinental, Dad? Transcontinental. Marcus repeated, a dangerous edge to his voice. Officer Collins, Captain Wilson. The company I own and operate is called Nexus Digital Security. Perhaps you've heard of it. We are the premier digital security firm for the global transportation industry. And for the last 3 years, Nexus Digital Security has held the exclusive multi-billion-dollar contract to protect Transcontinental Airlines' entire digital infrastructure. Marcus's words fell like hammer blows in the silent cabin. That includes their reservation systems, their internal networks, their flight control software, and most importantly, their passenger data liability protocols. Silence. Absolute stunned silence. Elizabeth Harrington's smug expression began to dissolve, replaced by a flicker of confusion and then dawning horror. Collins and Wilson exchanged a look of disbelief. Captain Wilson's face showed a flash of recognition. He had attended a cybersecurity seminar 2 years ago where Marcus Roberts had been the keynote speaker, though they had never formally met. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. Marcus continued, his voice now dangerously soft. That contract, which is personally overseen by me, contains several key clauses. Among them are strict covenants regarding passenger treatment, anti-discrimination, and brand integrity. A publicly documented incident of racial profiling, especially one involving a federal officer and condoned by the flight's captain, constitutes what our legal team would call a catastrophic brand-damaging event. It is a material breach of our service agreement. He let that sink in for a moment. He wasn't just a rich dad complaining. He was the man who held the keys to their kingdom, and he was explaining in precise legal and financial terms how they had just violated the terms of their partnership. So here is what is going to happen. Marcus stated, his voice devoid of any emotion except for absolute certainty. You are not going to lay a hand on my daughter. You are not going to speak another word to her. Captain Wilson, you will return to your cockpit and you will wait for a call from your CEO, Howard Davidson, a man I have on speed dial, Officer Collins. You will stand down and await instructions from your superiors at the TSA, who will also be hearing from Mr. Davidson and then from my general counsel. My daughter will remain in her seat. This aircraft will not be going anywhere until this is resolved to my satisfaction. Marcus's voice sharpened to a razor edge. Today, you tried to remove my daughter from a seat. Tomorrow, I'll remove you from your career. He took a breath. Nia, sweetie, is that all clear? Yes, Dad. Nia whispered, a single tear of relief finally tracing a path down her cheek. Good. Stay on the line. I'm making another call now. Nia held the phone. the speaker still on. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation. Officer Collins stood frozen, his face pale, his mask of authority shattered. Captain Wilson looked like he had seen a ghost. Elizabeth Harrington had shrunk into her seat, her face ashen, trying to become invisible. The entire power dynamic on the aircraft had just been inverted by a single phone call. The prejudice had collided with a system of immense and now deeply personal corporate power, and the prejudice was about to be obliterated. 10:42 a.m., the moment everything changes. The second call was brutally efficient. Nia and everyone in the first-class cabin could hear the faint, tiny ringing from her phone speaker, followed by an alert professional voice. "Howard Davidson." "Howard, it's Marcus Roberts." Marcus's voice was back to its calm boardroom tone, but it was underlined with steel. "Marcus, to what do I owe the pleasure I trust our Q3 projections are looking solid." Davidson's voice was jovial. The sound of a man who believed he was talking to a valued business partner. "We have a problem, Howard. A 5-alarm fire. I'm on the phone with my 17-year-old daughter, Nia. She's currently in seat 2A on your flight 457 from Denver to SFO, and she's being threatened with arrest by a federal air marshal while your captain stands by and watches." There was a moment of dead air on the other end. The joviality vanished, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. "What, Marcus? That's impossible. There must be a mistake." "The only mistake," Howard Marcus said coolly, "will be yours if you don't handle this in the next 90 seconds. My daughter has been racially profiled by another passenger. Your crew failed to de-escalate, and a federal officer is now threatening to put her in handcuffs because she refused to be illegally removed from her seat. I have this entire interaction on an open line. It is being recorded." Nia glanced at Dr. Patel, who gave her a subtle affirmative nod. His own phone still discreetly pointed forward. "The officer's name is Richard Collins. The captain is a Mr. Wilson." Marcus continued his words like hammer blows. "Howard, as per Section 12 subsection B of our agreement, I am officially flagging this incident as a critical security and liability failure. An agent of the federal government is acting in an unstable and biased manner on your aircraft. I no longer have confidence in the security of that plane. Furthermore, my daughter, a minor, is in a state of extreme distress due to the actions of your employees and this officer. This is a clear violation of your duty of care. Marcus, please." Davidson's voice was strained, panicked. "Let me get my head of operations on this. We'll sort it out. We'll apologize to your daughter. We'll offer compensation. We're past apologies, Howard. We're in the realm of consequences," Marcus said, his voice dropping. "Here is my demand. The flight is not to take off. My daughter is not to be moved or spoken to any further. You will have your senior most executive at Denver meet her at the gate with a full security detail to escort her to a private lounge. You will arrange for a private jet to take her to San Francisco as soon as it can be fueled." It was an audacious demand, a clear demonstration of power. "A private jet, Marcus. That's the opening offer," Howard Marcus said flatly. "The alternative is that my legal team files an injunction in the next 30 minutes citing the material breach of contract. We will suspend all Nexus services to Transcontinental pending a full federal investigation. Think about what happens to your airline tomorrow morning when the markets open and news breaks that your digital security provider, the best in the world, has declared your entire system a liability. Your stock will be in free fall by 9:31 a.m. Your choice. It was checkmate." The CEO of Transcontinental Airlines was being presented with two options: an astronomically expensive and embarrassing concession to one passenger, or the complete implosion of his company's public and financial standing. The silence on the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Officer Collins was sweating now, beads of moisture visible on his forehead. Captain Wilson had his eyes closed as if trying to will himself away from the career-ending disaster unfolding in his cabin. Finally, Davidson's voice came back defeated. "I understand. Consider it done, Marcus. I'll make the calls myself right now. My deepest, most sincere apologies to Nia. Don't apologize to me, Howard. Apologize to my daughter. And more importantly, Fix your company." Marcus said, then disconnected the call. Nia's phone returned to her conversation with her father. "Dad," she whispered, overwhelmed. "It's okay now, Nia B, it's over. Someone will be there for you shortly," he said, his voice finally softening, the paternal warmth returning. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. We'll talk more soon. I love you." "I love you too, Dad." The call ended. For a moment, the cabin remained in a state of suspended animation. Then the captain's phone buzzed. He answered it, his face turning even paler as he listened. He spoke only 2 words. "Yes, sir." He hung up and turned to face the first-ass cabin, his expression grim. He looked at Officer Collins, then at Elizabeth Harrington with a gaze of pure, unadulterated fury. Then he turned to the intercom, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." His voice was strained heavy with a new shocking weight. Due to an unforeseen and non-negotiable security concern that requires a full review of our operating protocols, Transcontinental Flight 457 has been cancelled. A wave of groans and angry shouts erupted from the back of the plane. Cancelled. A full flight doors closed, ready for pushback, was being cancelled. The absurdity of it was lost on the disgruntled passengers in economy and business class. "We ask that you please remain seated until the jet bridge is reattached. Ground staff will be in the terminal to assist you with rebooking. We apologize for the extreme inconvenience." The announcement was a bomb that detonated the fragile piece of the aircraft. Chaos erupted. People were yelling, demanding explanations. Flight attendants, looking utterly bewildered, tried to calm the passengers. But in the first-class cabin, there was a different kind of chaos. It was the quiet, devastating chaos of lives and careers imploding in real time. 10 to 52 a.m., the power balance inverts. Officer Collins, the immovable object of authority just minutes before, looked lost. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling too much to unlock it. Elizabeth Harrington was hyperventilating, her face a mask of pure terror. She had poked a bear only to discover it was a dragon. Her petty act of malice had grounded a 300-person intercontinental flight. She was no longer a victim. She was the cause of a multi-million-dollar incident. Amidst the pandemonium, Nia Roberts sat quietly in seat 2A. She watched the fallout, the shockwaves of her father's call spreading through the metal tube. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindictive. She just felt tired. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she felt safe. The jet bridge thumped against the fuselage. The sound of a rescue she never should have needed. The deplaning process was a study in contrasts. For the passengers in economy and business, it was a chaotic, infuriating ordeal. They shuffled off the plane into the terminal, grumbling about missed connections and ruined plans to be met by overwhelmed gate agents offering hotel vouchers and rebooking options. They were the collateral damage, unaware of the specific drama that had scuttled their journey. For the first-class cabin, it was a slow, deliberate extraction. Airline officials, led by a stone-faced woman in a sharp suit, the Denver station manager Victoria Ramirez, boarded the aircraft before anyone was allowed to leave. Her eyes immediately found Nia. "Miss Roberts?" "Ms." Ramirez asked, her voice a mixture of deference and extreme anxiety. "I'm Victoria Ramirez. On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, I am so sorry for what you have experienced. We have a private lounge ready for you. Please come with me." She pointedly ignored Officer Collins and Elizabeth Harrington. 2 Port Authority police officers followed her onto the plane. They did not approach Nia. Instead, they stood sentinel at the front of the cabin. As Nia gathered her things, her hands still shaking slightly, the adrenaline now wearing off, leaving her fingers trembling like autumn leaves. Sophia, the lead flight attendant, touched her arm gently. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her eyes filled with genuine remorse and anger. "I've already requested to file a full incident report. If you need a witness for anything, here's my personal number." She discreetly passed Nia a slip of paper. "Thank you," Nia said the words, feeling inadequate. "No, thank you. Sophia replied softly, "for standing your ground, for showing Miguel what courage looks like." She glanced at her younger colleague, who was watching them with a mixture of shame and awe. We both needed to see that. Dr. Patel, the businessman from 3C, paused as he passed her in the aisle. He leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "I have the entire thing on video. The things," she said, "the officer, everything, I will be sending it to the airline and to the news media. What they did was not right." He gave her a respectful nod and continued on his way. Dr. Patel Nia said, recognizing him suddenly, "Our Dr. Amir Patel, the civil rights professor who wrote Invisible Barriers. I read your book for my social studies thesis." The academic's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with a warm smile. "Indeed, I am. And now I've witnessed firsthand what I've only documented secondhand. Your courage today was remarkable, Miss Roberts. Would you consider allowing me to include this incident, anonymously of course, in my upcoming research? It illustrates perfectly how seemingly neutral security protocols can be weaponized to enforce social hierarchies." "Yes." Naya nodded. "If it helps prevent this from happening to someone else, I'm all for it." Nia walked off the plane, escorted by Ms. Ramirez, leaving the wreckage behind her. She didn't look back. Once she was gone, the atmosphere shifted. Miss Ramirez turned to the Port Authority officers. "Officer Collins and Ms. Harrington are to be escorted to separate interview rooms. Their statements are required for our internal investigation and the federal inquiry that will be following. They are not to leave the airport." The word inquiry landed like a stone. Elizabeth Harrington began to sob a pathetic theatrical display that earned no sympathy. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just concerned," she wailed, as an officer gently but firmly guided her by the elbow. Officer Richard Collins said nothing. The color had completely drained from his face. As a federal agent, he knew what an inquiry meant. It meant his career was at minimum on hold. More likely, it was over. He had operated on instinct on a lifetime of ingrained biases and had picked a fight with the one person on that plane he could not afford to cross. He was escorted off his broad shoulders, slumped in defeat. The authority he had wielded so brutally just 30 minutes earlier had evaporated completely. In the terminal, the contrast continued. Regular passengers milled about in frustrated confusion, forming long lines at customer service desks, arguing for compensation and alternate flights. Most of them cast annoyed glances at the private lounge where Nia had been whisked away, assuming it was filled with privileged elite passengers getting preferential treatment. They had no idea that behind those frosted glass doors, a 17-year-old girl was at the center of a corporate hurricane. Inside the lounge, Nia sat in a plush armchair sipping a cup of tea that had been pressed into her hands. The shock was starting to wear off, leaving behind a strange mixture of relief, anger, and unease. She was grateful for her father's intervention, but there was something deeply troubling about the entire sequence of events. Miss Roberts, Ms. Ramirez, said sitting across from her, "I want to personally assure you that what happened today is being taken with the utmost seriousness. Mr. Davidson has dispatched our corporate jet to take you to San Francisco as soon as possible. It's being fueled now and should be ready within the hour." Nia nodded, still processing. Additionally, Ms. Ramirez continued, her voice hushed with professional awe. "Your father has requested that we secure your prototype during transit. We've arranged for specialized handling to ensure it reaches the Horizon facility safely." Of course they had. The mention of her father sent a complex wave of emotions through Nia. Pride, gratitude, but also a nagging discomfort. What would have happened if she had been just any other 17-year-old black girl? What if her father hadn't been Marcus Roberts of Nexus Digital Security? What if she had been the daughter of a teacher, a nurse, a factory worker? The answer was brutally clear. She would have been marched off that plane, possibly in handcuffs. Her protestations would have meant nothing. Her future would have been imperiled by an arrest record. The prototype, her dream, would have been damaged or confiscated. All because a woman in seat 2B decided she didn't look like she belonged in first class. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Everything okay, Victoria? Taking care of you," she texted back. "Yes, thank you for what you did." His response came immediately. Always. No one messes with my little girl. She smiled slightly, but the unease persisted. Her father's power had saved her, but it was a reminder of how fragile justice could be when it depended on privilege and connections rather than being a universal right. 11:08 a.m. The aftermath begins. Meanwhile, across the terminal, a very different scene was unfolding. Elizabeth Harrington sat in a sterile interview room, her perfect makeup now streaked with tears, her composure shattered. Across from her sat stern-faced airline security officials and a legal representative. The recording of her phone call, where she falsely claimed Nia was aggressive and threatening, had been replayed for her. Her attempts to explain away her words as a misunderstanding were met with stony silence. Ms. Harrington, the legal representative, said her voice clinical and detached. The evidence suggests you knowingly made false statements that triggered a security response. These actions resulted in the cancellation of a flight with 300 passengers, costing the airline approximately $350,000 in direct expenses, not including the substantial reputational damage. Elizabeth's face crumpled. I was just concerned. You were not concerned, the representative cut her off. You were prejudiced, and you weaponized that prejudice in a way that created a substantial liability for this airline. We are currently evaluating our legal options regarding civil damages. The blood drained from Elizabeth's face. Civil damages lawsuits, financial ruin. The full weight of her actions was finally sinking in. Furthermore, the security official added, "Your name has been added to our no-fly list effective immediately and indefinitely. You will not be flying on transcontinental airlines or any of our code-share partners in the future." Elizabeth's eyes widened in horror. "You can't do that. I travel for work. I need what you need." Miss Harrington is a lawyer," the representative replied coolly, and perhaps some serious self-reflection. A moment of recognition flickered across her face. "Roberts, wait. Marcus Roberts. I interviewed for a position at Nexus Digital Shield 3 years ago. They rejected me." The security officials exchanged glances. This was a new and troubling dimension to her behavior. "Is that why you targeted his daughter?" The representative asked, her voice hardening. "No, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." Elizabeth broke off the realization of how deep a hole she had dug for herself, finally hitting home. In another room, Officer Richard Collins was facing an even more severe reckoning. His superior, a stone-faced senior agent from the Air Marshal Service who had been flown in from Washington, D.C., sat across from him. On the table between them lay Collins's badge and service weapon. 20 years. Collins, the senior agent, said, his voice laced with disgust. 20 years in the service, and you throw it all away because you couldn't see past your own prejudices. Sir, I was responding to a credible security concern. Bullshit, the agent snapped. I've reviewed the flight attendant statement. I've seen the video. You didn't verify? You didn't investigate. You saw a young black woman and decided she was the threat. You let your bias override your training, and now the entire service has to deal with the fallout. Collins's shoulders slumped. There was no defense, no justification that would stand up to scrutiny. Your suspension is effective immediately, the agent continued. A formal inquiry will follow, but I'm going to be blunt with you, Collins. Start updating your resume. Your career with the Air Marshal Service is over. Do you know who her father is? Collins asked, a trace of bitterness in his voice. I don't care if she's the daughter of a fry cook or the president. The agent replied, standing. Your job was to assess threats, not enforce someone's notion of who belongs where. You failed at the most basic level of your duty. Back in the private lounge, Ms. Ramirez approached Nia with a tablet. Miss Roberts, we've received word that the corporate jet is ready. Also, your father asked me to show you this. She handed Nia the tablet, which displayed a news article that had just been published online. The headline read, Transcontinental Airways announces major overhaul of anti-discrimination training and policies. The article detailed how Transcontinental was committing to a comprehensive review and reformation of its crew training, passenger complaint procedures and security protocols with a specific focus on eliminating bias. The changes included mandatory scenario-based training for all customer F-facing staff, a new verification protocol requiring multiple crew members to confirm any passenger complaint before security intervention, body cameras for security personnel during passenger interactions, an independent review board to handle discrimination complaints, revised passenger removal procedures with strict guidelines and oversight. It mentioned a substantial financial commitment to this effort, including the establishment of a scholarship fund for underrepresented youths interested in aviation careers. Most surprisingly, the scholarship was to be named the Nia Roberts STEM Initiative. Nia looked up stunned. This is happening now. Already Ms. Ramirez nodded a small, genuine smile, breaking through her professional facade. Your father is a very persuasive man, and I think the airline realized that true change couldn't wait for the next board meeting. The financial implications are significant, Ms. Ramirez added. Initial estimates put the training program at $15 million in the first year alone. The scholarship fund has been endowed with $5 million, but our CFO has projected that the long-term benefits reduced legal exposure, improved customer loyalty, and enhanced brand reputation will actually result in a net profit within 36 months. Nia handed the tablet back, a complex emotion swelling in her chest. It wasn't vindication or triumph. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the realization that sometimes justice wasn't just about punishing the wrong, but transforming the system that allowed the wrong to happen in the first place. As she was escorted to the waiting corporate jet, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the terminal windows. She was still the same Nia who had boarded Flight 457 just hours ago. Still a 17-year-old girl with dreams of changing the world with her neural interface. But something fundamental had shifted. She had glimpsed the ugly underbelly of privilege, and prejudice had felt its cold breath on her face, had nearly been crushed by its weight, and she had survived. Not just survived, but catalyzed change. The corporate jet was a sleek Gulfstream G650, a flying testament to luxury that made the first-class cabin of Flight 457 look positively pedestrian by comparison. As she settled into one of the plush leather seats, the sole passenger in an aircraft designed for 16 NIA finally let the full weight of the day's events wash over her. The jet taxied smoothly away from the terminal, leaving behind the chaos, the inquiries, the shattered careers, and the 300 stranded passengers. All because one woman couldn't accept that a young black girl belonged in seat 2A, and one father refused to let injustice stand. The investigation into the Flight 457 incident was swift and merciless, driven by the combined pressure of an apoplectic CEO, a looming multi-billion-dollar contract breach, and the imminent threat of a public relations nightmare. Marcus Roberts' legal team had already been in contact, making it clear that full transparency and accountability were non-negotiable. Sophia Reynolds was interviewed first. She gave a calm, factual, and damning account of the entire event, from Elizabeth Harrington's initial snide remarks to Officer Collins's dismissal of her authority. Her written report was even more detailed, noting the time of every exchange. "I've stayed silent before. Never again," Sophia said firmly at the conclusion of her testimony. "I watched a similar incident 2 years ago and didn't speak up. I lost a promotion because I was afraid to rock the boat. It cost me professionally, but that girl that day, it cost her so much more. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again." Miguel Rodriguez was next. In his interview, he was a wreck, alternating between tears and terrified apologies. He admitted that he had buckled under Elizabeth's threat of a complaint and had not followed protocol by immediately deferring to his senior partner, Sophia. "I was afraid," he said, his voice breaking. "My mother's medication costs doubled last month. My sister's tuition is due next week. I thought I couldn't afford to lose this job, but I was wrong. I couldn't afford to lose my integrity." Then came Dr. Four Patel's video. He had emailed it to the Transcontinental Corporate Affairs Office before he even left the terminal. The high-quality audio and clear video were undeniable. It captured Elizabeth's venomous, "I don't feel safe" phone call. It showed Collins's aggression, his hand on his weapon, his threats to the calm-seated teenager. It showed Sophia's attempts to de-escalate and Collins's sexist, dismissive retort. Dr. Patel, as it turned out, wasn't just any witness. He was a leading civil rights academic who specialized in transportation discrimination. His accompanying letter noted that he was already incorporating the incident into his upcoming book on bias in commercial aviation. The video was the nail in the coffin, a perfect, unblinking record of the prejudice and abuse of power that had taken place. This footage, Dr. Patel wrote in his submission, demonstrates exactly what I've been documenting for years: the invisible infrastructure of exclusion that operates in supposedly public spaces. The remarkable aspect of this case is not that it happened these incidents occurred daily, but that it was captured so thoroughly, and that there were actual consequences for the perpetrators. Elizabeth Harrington's interview was a disaster. She tried to play the victim, portraying Nia as sullen and unresponsive, and herself as a concerned citizen. But when confronted with Dr. Patel's video, her story crumbled. Her lies were laid bare, her manufactured fear exposed as petty, vindictive racism. She became belligerent, then tearful, then silent. The revelation of her failed interview at Nexus Digital Security 3 years earlier added another disturbing dimension to her behavior. While she insisted she hadn't recognized Marcus Roberts' name or made the connection to NIA investigators remained skeptical, the coincidence seemed too perfect. Even if true, it didn't matter. Her behavior had been inexcusable regardless of motive. After the interviews, Elizabeth's life began to unravel with alarming speed. The next morning, her phone rang. It was her boss at Westbrook Pharmaceuticals, the chief operating officer. "Elizabeth, I need you in my office immediately." He said, his tone colder than she had ever heard it. "I'm in Denver," she replied. "My flight was, can I know where you are and why?" He interrupted. "It's all over Twitter. First Class Karen is trending nationally, and your name and our company are being dragged through the mud. Get back to New York by whatever means necessary." Her blood ran cold as she hung up. She hadn't considered that aspect. The public humiliation, the digital record that could follow her forever. She booked an overpriced ticket on another airline flying economy class. The irony not lost on her. By the time she arrived in New York the next day, it was too late. She was met at the office by security, who escorted her to a conference room where HR was waiting with termination papers. 22 years at the company gone in a 10-minute meeting. "Your actions directly contradict our company values," the HR director said mechanically. "We cannot and will not be associated with such behavior." Westbrook Pharmaceuticals was in the midst of a major diversity initiative and could not afford to have an executive publicly exposed as racially biased. The viral video of Elizabeth demanding that a black teenager be removed from first class was toxic. She was given 30 minutes to clean out her desk under supervision. Former colleagues averted their eyes as she passed. By afternoon, her company email was deactivated. Her access cards disabled, her office reassigned. The spiral continued. 2 days after the incident, she returned to her Upper East Side apartment to find a letter from the board of her co-op. Her presence in the building was causing reputational concerns. Neighbors had complained. Would she consider selling her unit? Her friends stopped returning calls. Invitations were rescinded. Her sister in Connecticut asked her not to visit for a while just until this blows over. But it didn't blow over. The internet's memory was long, and Elizabeth Harrington's moment of unfiltered prejudice was preserved forever in high definition. Any Google search of her name would now bring up the incident as the top result. She became unemployable in her field. Executive recruiters who had once courted her now ignored her emails. The civil suit from Transcontinental was the final blow. The airline's lawyers had calculated the precise cost of the cancelled flight, the rebooking of 300 passengers, the hotel accommodations, the PR damage control, and the corporate jet provided to Nia. The total came to just over $1.2 million. Elizabeth's attorney advised her to settle. "They have a rock-a-lid case, Miss Harrington. The video alone is damning. We can try to negotiate the amount, but if this goes to court, you will lose, and the amount could be much higher. Her life savings, her retirement accounts, her investment portfolio. All of it would be wiped out. She would have to sell her apartment, move to a cheaper city, start over in her 50s with a toxic digital footprint following her wherever she went. All because she couldn't accept that a black teenager had a right to sit in first class. In the months that followed, Elizabeth went through a profound personal crisis. The loss of her career, social standing, and financial security forced her to confront the beliefs that had led to her downfall. At first, she was bitter and defensive, convinced she was the victim of cancel culture and political correctness. But slowly, painfully, she began to see her actions through a different lens. She started therapy initially to deal with the depression that followed her public shaming. But the process evolved into something deeper. For perhaps the first time in her life, she was forced to examine her own prejudices and the harm they had caused. "I had to lose everything to see what I'd become," she would later write in a personal essay. "I'd spent my whole life believing I wasn't racist because I didn't use slurs or join hate groups. But there I was on video trying to remove a young woman from a space simply because I didn't think she belonged there." It would take 2 years of self-examination therapy and education before Elizabeth would emerge as a changed person. The journey was neither quick nor easy, but it was genuine. She would eventually channel her experience into a book titled Confronting My Bias, which documented her journey from privileged ignorance to painful awareness. The hardest part, she wrote in the book's introduction, was recognizing that my actions that day weren't an aberration. They were the logical conclusion of beliefs I'd held my entire life. Beliefs I'd never questioned because I didn't have to. That's the insidious nature of privilege. It allows you to move through the world without ever having to examine the assumptions that shape your reality. The book unexpectedly became a valuable tool for amphibious training programs. Elizabeth's raw honesty about her own failings resonated with other white professionals who recognized aspects of themselves in her story. Her fall from grace became a cautionary tale that actually helped advance the very cause she had once undermined. Richard Collins stood before his bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., staring at a reflection he barely recognized. 3 weeks had passed since Flight 457. His face looked older, the lines deeper, the shadows under his eyes permanent. Today was the day of the hearing that would formally end his career. The suspension had been immediate, but the bureaucracy of termination moved more slowly. He had been ordered to appear before a disciplinary panel to make a final statement before the official verdict was handed down. His hands shook as he knotted his tie. In 20 years as a federal air marshal, he had never once had to draw his weapon. He had prided himself on his ability to assess threats quickly and accurately. But in 10 minutes with Nia Roberts, he had revealed a fundamental flaw in that assessment process. A bias so deep he hadn't even recognized it until it was laid bare in the harsh light of Dr. Patel's video. The night before, his wife Sarah had finally said what he hadn't been able to admit to himself. "You treated that girl differently because she was black," she had said quietly as they sat on opposite ends of the couch. "And now you're paying the price. We're all paying the price." She was right. Their savings were dwindling. The mortgage payment was due next week. Their son's college tuition for next semester was in jeopardy, all because of a moment of prejudice that he couldn't take back. "I keep thinking about her face," he told his wife. She looked like Amara when she was that age. Amara was his niece, his brother's daughter, who had recently started college. If someone had treated Amara that way, he couldn't finish the sentence. The realization of his hypocrisy was too painful. At the hearing, he sat alone at a table facing 5 senior officials from the Air Marshal Service and the Department of Homeland Security. His union representative had advised him to simply apologize, accept responsibility, and hope for some remnant of his pension. Marshal Collins, the chairwoman, began, "We've reviewed the evidence in this case, including the video taken by Dr. Patel and the statements from airline personnel. Do you wish to make a statement before we render our decision?" Collins cleared his throat. For a moment he considered pleading for his job, making excuses, claiming it was a simple misunderstanding. But as he looked at the stern faces before him, he knew it would be futile, and more importantly, it would be false. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice. I allowed bias to cloud my judgment. I intimidated a minor. I threatened a passenger who had done nothing wrong. I violated my oath and my training. There's no excuse for what I did, and I accept the consequences. The chairwoman nodded almost imperceptibly. Mr. Collins, the panel has unanimously decided to terminate your employment with the Federal Air Marshal Service effective immediately. You will forfeit 80% of your pension benefits. Your security clearance is revoked. You are required to surrender all government property, including your credentials, before leaving this building. This hearing is adjourned. 20 years of service ended in a 90-second statement. Collins walked out of the building into the bright Washington sunlight, a civilian for the first time in 2 decades. That night, he received an email from a former colleague still with the service. The subject line read simply "changes." The body of the email explained that in direct response to the Flight 457 incident, the Air Marshal Service was implementing mandatory amphibious training for all personnel. Body cameras would now be required during all passenger interventions. A civilian oversight committee was being formed to review complaints of discriminatory behaviour. Collins's failure was becoming a catalyst for change, a case study in how not to perform the job. His name would never be mentioned, but his actions would be analysed by every new recruit. He closed the email and stared at the blank screen. Then he opened a new search window and typed Richard Collins' resume. It was time to start over. His first 5 job applications went unanswered. His 6th for a night security position at a self-air storage facility in Virginia resulted in an interview. The pay was less than a third of what he had made as an air marshal. The manager, a former police officer, recognized Collins's name from the news reports, but hired him anyway. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said as he handed Collins the employee handbook. "Even if it's at the bottom of the ladder." As Collins put on the polyester uniform of a private security guard, he thought about Nia Roberts, about how close he had come to derailing her future because of his prejudice. He wondered if she knew what had happened to him, if she cared. He wondered if she understood that her refusal to surrender her seat had not just protected her dignity, but had forced an entire federal agency to confront its flawed practices. He clocked in for his first shift at 1,000 p.m., patrolling the quiet rows of storage units with a flashlight, a man invisible to the world, marked only by his mistakes. In the following months, Collins underwent his own transformation. The fall from federal agent to night watchman had been humbling, but it had also freed him from the institutional armor that had shielded him from examining his own biases. During the long, quiet nights patrolling the storage facility, he had time to think about his career, his actions, and the assumptions that had guided them. 6 months after Flight 457, he reached out to his pastor, a man he had avoided since his dismissal from the service. "I need to talk," he said simply. The conversation that followed lasted for hours, touching on issues of justice, forgiveness, and redemption. "You made a terrible mistake," Pastor Williams told him. "But it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. The question is, what are you going to do with this experience?" It was a question Collins had been asking himself. The answer came gradually. He began volunteering with a local youth program, mentoring teenagers from disadvantaged backgrounds. He spoke candidly with them about his failure and what he had learned from it. The work was challenging. Many of the kids initially distrusted him once they learned about his past. But over time, he earned their respect through his honesty and commitment. By the time his niece Amara applied for the Nia Roberts STEM Initiative scholarship 3 years later, Richard Collins had become a different man. When Amara was selected as one of the recipients, Collins felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in his niece's gratitude for the opportunity she was being given, and a strange sense of karmic completion. His failure had opened a door for the next generation, including his own family. Howard Davidson, CEO of Transcontinental Airlines, had been in the business for 35 years. He had weathered economic downturns, terrorist attacks, fuel crises, and pandemics. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the crisis triggered by Flight 457. The morning after the incident, he gathered his executive team in the Crisis Management Center at company headquarters in Dallas. The mood was grim. The stock had already dropped 3% in pre-market trading as news of the incident spread through financial circles. Ladies and gentlemen, Davidson began his voice grave. We are facing an existential threat. Nexus Digital Security is not just our cybersecurity provider. They are the backbone of every digital system we operate. Our reservation system, our flight operations, our customer data, our internal communications, all of it runs through their platforms. If Marcus Roberts decides to pull the plug, we cease to function as an airline within hours. The chief financial officer raised his hand. Can't we fight this? It was one incident. Surely he can't legally. Have you seen the video? Davidson interrupted, his face flushing with anger. Have you actually watched what happened to his daughter? Because I have. 3 times. And each time I became more certain that if it were my child, I wouldn't just pull a contract. I'd burn the whole company to the ground. He took a breath, composing himself. This isn't about legal standing. This is about doing what's right. A 17-year-old honors student was nearly arrested for sitting in a seat she paid for, and our employees either enabled it or stood by and watched. That is unacceptable on every level. He turned to his chief operating officer. Alicia, I need a complete overhaul of our crew training protocols. Every employee from baggage handlers to pilots needs to undergo comprehensive Antibius training. I want outside experts brought in, and I want it to begin this week, not next quarter. Next, he addressed the Chief of Public Relations. Mark what I need: a statement that doesn't just apologize, but commits us to specific measurable changes. And I want to announce the Nia Roberts STEM initiative today. Initial funding of $5 million focused on supporting young women of color, pursuing careers in aviation and technology. The VP of Human Resources spoke up. What about Captain Wilson Davidson's expression hardened? He's been suspended pending review, but the preliminary recommendation is demotion to cargo routes. He failed in his duty as captain. However, he was placed in an impossible position by Collins, so termination seems excessive. And the flight attendant, Sophia Reynolds, is being promoted to a training position. She did what she could in an untenable situation. Miguel Rodriguez will undergo additional training and be placed on probation. His failure was one of inexperience and fear, rather than malice. As the meeting continued, specific action items were assigned timelines, established budgets allocated. By the end of the day, Transcontinental had issued a public statement acknowledging the incident, apologizing unreservedly, and committing to a fundamental reimagining of our approach to passenger dignity and staff training. The news was received with cautious optimism by industry analysts. The stock stabilized. Marcus Roberts, through a spokesperson, expressed approval of the initial steps, but made it clear that Nexus Digital Security would be closely monitoring the implementation of these promises. Within a week, Transcontinental had engaged a leading diversity consultancy to redesign their crew training programs, established the Nia Roberts STEM initiative with a public website and application portal, revised their passenger complaint procedures to require verification by multiple crew members before security intervention, implemented a new Fair Skies protocol that specifically addressed potential racial bias in first-class cabins, created an anonymous reporting system for employees to flag discriminatory behavior by colleagues or passengers. The speed and comprehensiveness of these changes sent shockwaves through the airline industry. Other carriers, recognizing the potential for similar incidents and equally catastrophic consequences, began preemptively reviewing their own protocols. However, not everyone embraced these changes enthusiastically. The Airline Employees Union expressed concerns about additional responsibilities being placed on crew members without proper compensation. Some pilots' groups argued that the new protocols undermined captains' authority over their aircraft. A conservative media outlet ran a segment questioning whether Transcontinental was overreacting to one misunderstanding, suggesting the airline was caving to woke pressure. A group calling itself Americans for Traditional Values announced a boycott of the airline, claiming it was pandering to political correctness. Davidson faced these challenges head-on. In a company-wide meeting, he addressed the resistance directly. "I've heard the concerns, I've seen the headlines, and I understand that change is uncomfortable. But let me be absolutely clear. This is not about politics. This is not about being woke. This is about basic human dignity and doing what's right. It's also about business survival. We cannot and will not be an airline that allows paying passengers to be humiliated and threatened because of the color of their skin." He paused, looking around the room. "And for those of you who think this is an overreaction to one incident, understand this. It's never just one incident. For every Nia Roberts with a powerful father and video evidence, there are hundreds of passengers who suffer in silence, who never fly with us again, who tell their friends and family about how they were treated. That's not just morally wrong, it's terrible business." The internal resistance gradually subsided as employees began to understand that this was not a temporary PR move, but a fundamental shift in company culture. The training programs, initially met with eye rolls and complaints about sensitivity training, earned grudging respect as they focused on practical scenarios and real-world skills rather than abstract concepts. Davidson's financial team had run the numbers, and the business case was clear. The training initiative would cost approximately $15 million in its first year, plus another $5 million for the scholarship fund. There would be additional ongoing costs for monitoring reporting and periodic retraining, but the potential savings were even more significant. Legal settlements for discrimination cases averaged $1 to $3 million each, and that didn't include the reputational damage. Customer retention improvements of just 2% would translate to over $20 million in annual revenue. Reduced staff turnover would save millions in training and recruitment costs. Within 6 months, the financial benefits were already becoming apparent. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 4.7%. Staff turnover had decreased by 8%. Social media sentiment about the airline had improved dramatically. And most importantly, reported incidents of passenger crew conflicts had declined by 23%. Delta United and American all announced enhanced training initiatives within days of transcontinental statement. Industry publications ran special issues on bias in air travel. The TSA issued new guidelines for air marshals interacting with passengers. The impact wasn't limited to the United States. International carriers from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East began implementing their own anti-bias initiatives. British Airways established a passenger rights advisory board. Emirates Airlines created a multilingual customer respect training program. Lufthansa developed new protocols for resolving passenger disputes. What had begun as one woman's prejudice against one teenager had catalyzed a sea change in how an entire industry approached the concept of belonging and dignity in the shared spaces of air travel. 2 weeks after the incident, Howard Davidson received an unexpected message from Marcus Roberts. It was brief but meaningful. Watching closely. "Impressed so far? Don't stop." Davidson forwarded the message to his executive team with a simple addition. "This is just the beginning." Nia's arrival at San Francisco International Airport was a stark contrast to her departure from Denver. A transcontinental executive met her at the private aviation terminal, escorting her to a waiting luxury SUV with tinted windows. Her prototype, carefully handled by white-gloved staff, was secured in a custom container and placed gently in the vehicle. The drive to the Horizon Applied Sciences Incubator in Silicon Valley was quiet. Nia watched the Bay Area landscape pass by her mind, still processing the whirlwind of the morning. At the horizon, campus, a cluster of sleek modern buildings set against rolling hills. Dr. Gabriela Morales was waiting. The program director, a brilliant neuroscientist in her mid-40s, greeted Nia with a warm embrace that surprised her with its sincerity. "Nia, I'm so glad you're here safely." Dr. Morales said, "We were horrified to hear what happened. Please know that you're among friends now." News of the incident had already reached Horizon. Dr. Morales had received a personal call from Marcus Roberts explaining the situation and the reason for Nia's delayed arrival. "Your accommodations have been prepared." Dr. Morales continued as they walked into the main building. We've set you up in one of our private suites, rather than the standard fellow dormitory. I hope that's acceptable." Nia nodded, grateful, but still feeling the emotional toll of the day. "Thank you. I appreciate that. Your prototype has already been taken to your lab space. We've assigned you a corner lab with extra security protocols given the value and importance of your work. Would you like to see it now, or would you prefer to rest first?" Nia considered for a moment. Part of her wanted nothing more than to curl up somewhere quiet and process what had happened. But another part, the builder, the creator, knew that losing herself in her work might be the best therapy. "I'd like to see the lab, please," she decided. The lab exceeded her expectations. State-of-the-art equipment, far beyond what she had access to at home or school, filled the spacious room. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto a peaceful courtyard with a small fountain. It was a space designed for creativity and innovation. As Dr. Morales showed her around, explaining the various resources available to her, Nia found herself slowly coming back to herself. This was why she had gotten on that plane this morning. This was the opportunity she had earned. No Elizabeth Harrington could take that away from her. "This is our neural mapping station," Dr. Morales explained, gesturing to a sophisticated array of equipment. It can capture neural activity with 500% greater resolution than standard EEG equipment. Your interface will be able to distinguish between thousands of distinct thought patterns. With this level of detail, Nia ran her fingers over the equipment, her mind already racing with possibilities. "The quantum processing chip I've developed uses a proprietary algorithm to translate neural signals into digital commands," she explained. "With this level of resolution, we could potentially map emotional states, not just conscious thoughts." Dr. Morales nodded, impressed. The applications would be revolutionary, not just for those with physical disabilities, but for anyone who struggles to communicate their internal experience. Nia looked up, a new idea forming. "Dr. Morales, have you ever considered how this technology might be used to document experiences of discrimination? The neural patterns associated with being unfairly judged or excluded might be distinct enough to create objective evidence." Dr. Morales tilted her head, intrigued. "That's not an application we've considered, but it's fascinating. An objective neural record of subjective experiences could have profound implications for legal and social justice contexts." "Exactly." Nia said, her voice growing stronger with excitement. "What if people could document these experiences in a way that couldn't be dismissed as overreacting or playing the victim?" Later in her suite, Nia finally had a proper video call with her father. Marcus's face filled her laptop screen, his eyes searching hers for signs of lingering distress. "How are you holding up, Nia B?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm okay, Dad," she replied, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The fellowship is amazing. Dr. Morales is brilliant, and the resources here are beyond anything I expected." Marcus nodded, but his gaze remained intent. "And how are you really?" The question hung in the air, an invitation to drop the brave face. Nia felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "I keep thinking about it." She admitted, her voice smaller now. "Not just what happened, but what could have happened. If you hadn't been who you are, if you hadn't had that leverage." "But I am. And I did," Marcus said firmly. "That's the world we live in, Nia. Power recognizes power. It shouldn't be that way, but it is." "That's what bothers me," Nia said, a hint of her usual intensity returning. "Justice shouldn't depend on who your father is or what company he owns. It should be a right, not a privilege." Marcus's expression softened with pride. "You're right. And that's why I didn't just stop at getting you off that plane. We're making changes, Nia. Real ones. I've been thinking about a new application for the neural interface," she told him, her eyes brightening. "What if we could use it to objectively document experiences of discrimination, create records that couldn't be dismissed or denied?" Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." As they talked, bouncing ideas back and forth, Nia felt the weight of the day's events begin to lift. Her father had protected her when she needed it, but now she was finding her own way to fight back, not with power or privilege, but with innovation and empathy. In the weeks that followed, Nia threw herself into her work at the fellowship, But the psychological impact of Flight 457 lingered. She found herself experiencing unexpected anxiety when boarding other flights for weekend visits home. She became hyper-aware of how people reacted to her presence in upscale restaurants and exclusive spaces. Sometimes she would wake from dreams in which Collins was dragging her off the plane in handcuffs. Her voice silenced her father's number, mysteriously missing from her phone. Recognizing that she needed support, Nia started working with a therapist who specialized in racial trauma. Simmons helped her process the complex emotions that had followed the incident. Fear, anger, guilt over the privilege that had saved her, and even shame for having needed rescue. "What happened to you was a form of violence," Dr. Simmons explained during one of their sessions. "Not physical violence, but the violence of a razor, the attempt to remove you from a space you had every right to occupy. That leaves marks, even if they're not visible." Over time, Nia learned to integrate the experience into her sense of self without letting it define her. The anger she had felt transformed into a steady determination to create change. The fear evolved into a heightened awareness that she channeled into her work. Even the guilt became productive as she thought about ways to extend her privilege to others. "You didn't ask for your father's power or position," Dr. Simmons reminded her, "but you can choose how to use the advantages you have. That's not something to feel guilty about. It's something to be intentional about." This perspective shaped Nia's approach to her fellowship and her research. She wasn't just developing a neural interface anymore. She was creating a tool that could give voice to those who were routinely silenced, whether by physical disability or societal prejudice. The trauma never completely disappeared, but it became part of her story rather than a defining wound. One more experience that informed her understanding of the world and her place in it. 1 week after Flight 457, Marcus Roberts sat in his Manhattan office reviewing a detailed report from his legal team. The document outlined the changes transcontinental airlines had implemented so far, the commitments they had made for the future, and the metrics by which these efforts would be measured. It was impressive. Howard Davidson had not simply paid lip service to reform. He had initiated a fundamental restructuring of how his airline handled passenger interactions. The training protocols were being completely redesigned. The passenger complaint procedures now required multiple verifications before security intervention. The Nia Roberts STEM initiative was already accepting applications. But Marcus knew that change within a single airline, even a major one like Transcontinental, wasn't enough. The problem was industry-wide, perhaps even society-wide. And he was in a unique position to influence that broader landscape. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a woman answered. "Aisha Carter's office. This is Marcus Roberts for Miss Carter. Is she available?" There was a brief pause. Then the line clicked. "Marcus, good to hear from you. How's Nia doing at Horizon?" Aisha Carter was the CEO of Pinnacle Hospitality Group, one of the largest hotel chains in the world. Like Marcus, she was a self-made executive who had built an empire despite the barriers of racism and sexism. She's thriving. "Thanks for asking. Listen, Aisha, I'm calling about something specific. You may have heard about an incident on a transcontinental flight last week." "I did indeed." "Your daughter showed remarkable poise." "She reminds me of my own daughter." "Thank you. The incident has prompted some significant changes at Transcontinental, but I believe we have an opportunity to push for broader reform across multiple industries. Your expertise in hospitality would be invaluable." Aisha didn't hesitate. "I'm in." "What are you thinking?" "A coalition CEOs from transportation, hospitality, retail, major service industries where these interactions occur daily. We develop shared standards, pool resources for training and technology, and create a certification program that consumers recognize and value." Interesting. A seal of approval that signals a commitment to dignity and fair treatment. Exactly. And companies that want the seal have to meet specific measurable benchmarks. I like it. Who else are you thinking of bringing in? Marcus listed several other CEOs, all leaders in their fields, all from underrepresented groups who understood personally the importance of the initiative. "Let me make some calls," Aisha said. "I think you'll find more support than you might expect." The business case for this is clear. No company wants to be the next viral video of discrimination. The initial response to Marcus's coalition idea was overwhelmingly positive. But as the details of the certification program began to take shape, resistance emerged from unexpected quarters. This is nothing short of corporate blackmail, declared the CEO of a major airline during an industry conference. Roberts is using his daughter's unfortunate experience to force his values on the entire sector. A Wall Street Journal op-ed questioned whether the coalition was creating a privatized enforcement mechanism for social justice ideology. Several industry associations expressed concerns about the cost of implementing the new standards and the potential legal implications of the certification process. Religious leaders also weighed in on the debate. Pastor James Williams of the National Faith Coalition praised the initiative as aligned with our core values of human dignity and respect, while Reverend Thomas Bradford of the Conservative Christian Alliance criticized it as corporate overreach into matters of personal conscience. Asian American advocacy groups pointed out that anti-Asian discrimination had been surging in transportation settings. "We've documented over 500 incidents in the past year alone," said Lucy Chen of the Asian American Justice Network. "We hope this initiative will address our community's concerns as well." Indigenous rights organizations raised questions about representation in the coalition's leadership. "We need a seat at the table," insisted Robert Bears of the Native American Rights Council. "Our people face unique forms of discrimination in travel and hospitality." Muslim travelers who had long dealt with heightened scrutiny and profiling expressed cautious optimism. "If this leads to actual changes in how security protocols are implemented, it could make a real difference for our community," said Fatima Ahmed of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Marcus had anticipated this pushback and was prepared for it. In a carefully worded response to the criticism, he emphasized the voluntary nature of the program and its focus on measurable outcomes rather than ideological compliance. "This isn't about forcing anyone to think a certain way," he explained in a CNBC interview. "It's about ensuring that all customers are treated with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance or background. That's not politics, it's good business." The coalition pressed forward refining its standards and building its certification framework. By the end of the month, the Coalition for Dignity in Service Industries had been formed. Charter members included Transcontinental Airlines, Pinnacle Hospitality Group, 3 major retail chains, 2 banking institutions, and a leading restaurant group. The coalition's first act was to establish a certification program called Dignity Assured with clear standards and independent verification. Companies seeking the certification had to implement specific training. Specific training programs establish transparent complaint procedures, conduct regular audits, and submit to mystery shopper-style testing. The initiative gained traction quickly, despite the vocal opposition. Consumers began looking for the Dignity Assured seal when making travel and accommodation choices. Companies that had initially hesitated found themselves at a competitive disadvantage. 6 months after the incident, the certification had become a recognized industry standard. Transcontinental, as the catalyst for the movement, was held up as a model of corporate responsibility and accountability. Howard Davidson, once a reluctant participant forced by circumstance to embrace change, had become one of its most vocal advocates. In a keynote speech at an industry conference, he candidly addressed the transformation. "Let me be clear," he told the audience of airline executives, "we didn't do this because we suddenly had a moral epiphany. We did it because a 17-year-old girl refused to surrender her dignity, and her father had the power to hold us accountable. But what began as a response to a crisis has become a cornerstone of our corporate identity. And the data shows it's not just the right thing to do, it's good business." He presented statistics showing increased customer satisfaction, improved employee retention, and even marginal improvements in on-time performance since the new protocols were implemented. "When you treat people with dignity, all people regardless of appearance, background, or status, they respond in kind. Our crews report fewer conflicts. Our customer service lines receive fewer complaints, and our passengers express greater loyalty to our brand." As Davidson spoke, Marcus Roberts sat in the back of the auditorium listening. He hadn't been invited officially, but he had wanted to hear firsthand how Transcontinental was presenting its transformation. After the speech, Davidson spotted him and approached, hand extended. "Marcus, I didn't know you'd be here." "Just keeping an eye on things," Marcus replied, shaking his hand. "Good speech. Honest. How's Nia doing?" "She's excelling at Horizon. Her neural interface project is evolving in some interesting directions." Davidson nodded. The scholarship program in her name has already awarded its first round of grants. 10 young women who might be the next generation of Nia Robertses. "That's good to hear," Marcus said. "Keep it up, Howard." "We're watching." "I know," Davidson replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. "That's the point, isn't it?" Nia stood at the front of the conference room at Horizon Applied Sciences, her presentation slides displayed on the large screen behind her. 3 months into her fellowship, she was delivering her first progress report to the board of directors and key investors. Her neural interface prototype had evolved significantly from the version she had carried onto Flight 457. The hardware was more streamlined, the software more responsive, the applications more diverse. As you can see from the data she explained, gesturing to a graph showing brainwave patterns. The interface can now distinguish between 87 distinct thought patterns with 95% accuracy. This represents a 32% improvement over our initial baseline. She clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed diagram of the neural interface hardware. "We've miniaturized the quantum processing core to just 3 millimeters square, allowing for nearly invisible placement behind the ear. The chip uses a proprietary algorithm that analyzes delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma waves, simultaneously creating a multi-dimensional neural signature that's unique to each thought pattern." The board members nodded appreciatively. Dr. Morales beamed with pride from the side of the room. But the most exciting development has been in the application space. Nia continued. "Beyond the medical uses we originally envisioned, we've discovered that the technology has profound implications for documenting subjective experiences." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a different set of neural patterns. These are the brainwave signatures associated with experiencing bias and discrimination. They're remarkably consistent across demographic groups, suggesting a universal neural response to being unfairly judged or excluded. The room grew quieter, more attentive. "We're developing a module we call Truth Witness that can objectively record these experiences, creating verifiable evidence of discrimination that could be used in legal, corporate, or educational contexts." One of the investors raised his hand. "What inspired this direction?" Miss Roberts Nia paused for a moment. "Personal experience. 3 months ago, I was nearly removed from a flight based on false accusations. If not for video evidence and my father's intervention, my career might have been derailed before it began." She let that sink in before continuing. "But most people don't have influential parents or bystanders recording video. Their experiences are dismissed as subjective, exaggerated, or imagined. Truth Witness could change that dynamic fundamentally." After the presentation, as the board members and investors filed out, Dr. Morales approached Nia. "That was exceptional, Nia. Not just the technical achievements, but the vision. You've taken a personal trauma and transformed it into innovation." "Thanks, Dr. Morales. I had a good example. My dad did the same thing, just with different tools." Later that evening, Nia received an unexpected email. It was from Sophia Reynolds, the flight attendant who had tried to help her on Flight 457. "Dear Nia," it read, "I wanted to let you know that I've been promoted to a senior training position with Transcontinental. They've asked me to help develop and implement the new Antibius protocols that will be required for all crew members. It's not a position I ever expected to have, but I'm determined to use it to make real change. Also, Miguel and I have started a support group for crew members to help each other stand up against discrimination without fear of repercussions. We call it Crew for Dignity, and it's already grown to over 200 members across different airlines. What happened to you should never happen to anyone else. Thank you for your courage. You've made more of a difference than you know. Warmly, Sophia Reynolds." Attached to the email was a news article. The headline read, Federal Air Marshal suspended after racial profiling incident on transcontinental flight. The article detailed Collins's suspension and the broader inquiry into profiling practices within the Air Marshal Service. It also mentioned that a passenger involved in making false claims had been permanently banned from flying with Transcontinental and its partners. Even more surprising was a follow-up story about a passenger named James Wilson, a 19-year-old community college student who had been allowed to remain in his first-class seat on a different transcontinental flight despite a similar complaint. The new protocols had already been implemented, and the crew had handled the situation properly, verifying his ticket, dismissing the unfounded complaint, and ensuring he enjoyed the service he had paid for. "Honestly, I was shocked," Wilson was quoted as saying. "I was ready to be kicked off because that's what usually happens." But the attendant just smiled, confirmed my seat, and told the other passenger that my presence wasn't up for debate. It felt like being treated like a person. Nia sat back in her chair, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that actions had consequences, that the people who had tried to humiliate and remove her were facing the repercussions of their behavior. But there was no joy in it, no sense of vindication or triumph. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that justice, when it came, was not about revenge, but about restoration and reform. She opened her laptop and began to work on her neural interface project with renewed purpose. What had happened on Flight 457 had shown her in the starkest possible terms how it felt to be silenced, to have your voice and your rights dismissed. It strengthened her resolve to create a technology that would ensure no one was silenced by circumstance, that everyone had the means to express their truth. As her fingers flew across the keyboard, coding the algorithms that would translate neural patterns into speech, Nia Roberts was doing more than developing a technology. She was crafting her own response to injustice, not with power or privilege, but with innovation and empathy. 6 months after flight, 457 Miguel Sanchez sat nervously in the waiting area outside Howard Davidson's office. The CEO of Transcontinental Airlines had personally requested this meeting, and Miguel had no idea why. After the incident, Miguel had been placed on probation and assigned to additional training. He had expected to be fired, but Sophia Reynolds had advocated for him, arguing that his failure had been one of inexperience and fear rather than malice. The training had been eye-opening. Led by outside experts, it had focused not just on company procedures, but on the history and psychology of bias, the courage required to stand up to authority, and the importance of moral clarity in moments of conflict. Miguel had embraced the training with a fervor that surprised his instructors. He had shared his story openly, using his own failure as a teaching tool for others. He had written an essay about the experience that had been circulated among the training staff as an example of honest self-reflection. And now somehow he was sitting outside the CEO's office, wondering if his airline career was about to end after all. "Mr. Sanchez," the executive assistant smiled at him. "Mr. Davidson will see you now." Miguel entered the spacious office with its panoramic view of the Dallas skyline. Howard Davidson rose from behind his desk to greet him. "Miguel, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." As Miguel sat, Davidson returned to his chair and studied him for a moment. "Do you know why I asked to see you today?" "No, sir." "I don't." Davidson nodded. "I've been following your progress since the incident on Flight 457. Your training evaluations, your peer reviews, your essay about what you learned from that day." Miguel tensed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I want to offer you a scholarship." Davidson said, surprising him completely. "A full ride to complete your education part of the broader transcontinental educational initiative we're launching." Miguel stared, unable to process what he was hearing. I don't understand." "What happened on that flight was a failure, at multiple levels," Davidson explained. "You were placed in an impossible position, caught between a passenger who threatened your livelihood and a teenager who deserved your protection. You made the wrong choice, but you've owned that choice and learned from it in a way that many never would." He slid a folder across the desk. "The scholarship covers tuition, books, and a stipend. You can continue working part-time if you wish, or focus entirely on your studies. When you graduate, there will be a management position waiting for you here if you want it. Miguel's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside was a formal offer letter and program details.